This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV Profit.
High interest rates inhibit the investor and are a burden on every class of borrowers.
We feel rates must come down because they are definitely coming in the way of growth.
I don't believe that it is the interest rates which are preventing investment. There are a lot of supply side factors which are causing inflation.
Yet another indication that the slowdown is worsening. The industrial output data for June has shown a contraction, yet again adding to the growing number of worries for policymakers. Hello and welcome to We Mean Business. I'm Shweta Rajpal-Kohli, and the question we're asking on the show is whether high interest rates are hurting the growth and what needs to be done to revive the Indian economy. Let me introduce our guests on the show today. I spoke earlier with Mr. Adi Godrej, Chairman of the Godrej Group and President of CII. We've also got with us here Mr. R.V. Kanoria, President of FICCI, also Mr. T.V. Mohandas Pai, Chairman of Manipal Global Education Services Limited, joins us from Bangalore. With me here in the Delhi studio, Nalan Kohli, National Executive Member of the BJP, and we've got Sajid Chenoy, India Economist of JP Morgan in Mumbai, and Mr. Mukesh Agarwal, President of CRISIL Research, also joining us from Mumbai. Thank you all for being with us here on the show. But let me start with the interview that I had done with Mr. Adi Godrej earlier. Mr. Godrej, hope clearly building up that Mr. Chidambaram is now in charge and things can change very quickly. Are you sharing that hope and optimism?
Yes, I think the statement he made on Monday was very refreshing. I think he clearly tackled all the major areas that need attention. He has very categorically stated that he would like to take action in several different fields, and I do expect that this will be done in the near future and that economic growth will revive quite well.
Mr. Godrej, the big question we are trying to address on the show today is whether high interest rates particularly are hurting growth, and are you hopeful that interest rates will be brought down over the next few months? I
do feel so. I am very hopeful that interest rates can be brought down over the rest of the calendar year. I feel that the Reserve Bank was waiting for government action on the fiscal and other fronts, which Chidambaram has clearly enunciated, and Reserve Bank should work on inflationary expectations, with the Finance Minister promising to work on the fiscal deficit front, especially with appointment of a very high-powered committee under Mr. Kelkar. I expect that the Reserve Bank will take cognizance of this and reduce the rates, because the high interest rates is definitely contributing very strongly to the GDP growth slowdown. Two ways. One is investments into new industrial and infrastructure capacity is affected, but even more importantly, I think consumption of many items that depend on financing, for example, residential housing, autos, etc., has slowed down very considerably because interest rates and financing costs and mortgage rates are very high. So bringing down interest rates will certainly give a boost to growth. But Mr. Godrej, the Reserve Bank of India has held a view that higher interest rates are not necessarily hampering growth, and also the fact that lowering interest rates may not necessarily help growth. How do you respond to that? No, I don't agree with that, and that's not the stand the Reserve Bank is saying. They are saying that high interest costs are not the only thing that is affecting growth. They are right about that. There are many other things that need to be done, which also Mr. Chidambaram has addressed. But clearly, high interest rates are having an effect on growth.
All right, we have a new finance minister in charge, but there's also some bad news that's pouring in. A deficient monsoon. Can the finance minister really meet his promises on fiscal consolidation, given that his challenges have become even more intense now with the possibility of a drought?
Yes, true. But there are many ways the fiscal deficit can be addressed. Of course, one of them is subsidies. I think that needs to be done, because otherwise we'll be even derated by the global rating agencies. And that's very important, because otherwise our cost of debt, etc. will rise. Secondly, disinvestment is a very good way to create fiscal consolidation. Disinvestment opportunities are large, and if you start disinvestment, if fiscal deficit starts coming down, RBI takes action, a virtuous cycle is built whereby even more disinvestment can be undertaken. So a combination of this can certainly contain the fiscal deficit, and I'm sure an expert committee under Mr. Kelkar will do a good job in advising the government what is the best way to go about it. Despite the monsoon being deficient and despite drought-like conditions in some parts of the country, I think this can be tackled, and it will be successfully tackled.
Mr. Godrej, do we see the finance minister focusing on big ticket reforms, and what according to you should be his top priorities? Many actually say that you should just forget about reforms because he actually has a very narrow window of opportunity and he may like to actually focus on many other things. It is a long list out there.
I don't agree with this window being narrow philosophy which is being touted around, because I think reforms will help politically. I think people seem to feel that reforms will hurt politically. I don't agree with that philosophy. If you look at the state elections during the last 5 years, all the reformists, state governments, all the governments that created high growth rates have been re-elected. So I think politically reform will help the ruling coalition, and I think they will go ahead with it.
Mr. Godrej, also ironically, in the week that the finance minister has made such bold statements, we've also seen a number of growth downgrades coming in, mainly because of the possibility of a drought, the fact that we're now possibly in a drought year. Do you also think that growth can slip to 5.5% levels this year, and that we may not even make it to the 6% mark?
If the reform program is not implemented well, it could slip. The growth could slip. If the reform program is implemented well, we could get on the path of accelerated growth. And if the reform program is really well implemented, and if GST is implemented at the same time, I feel we could grow at over 8%, probably close to 9% in 13-14, if the reform program is taken forward briskly.
Mr. Godrej, if there's something that has clearly dampened investor sentiment more than anything else in the last few months, it's perhaps been some of those taxation changes introduced in the budget, the retrospective amendments as well as GAR. Do you see Mr. Chidambaram moving forward in trying to undo that damage?
Yes, I think if you read his statement carefully, you can see that he has also referred to that. And his statements are more or less in line with what CII has been saying. I think the perception of India has suffered on several counts. One of them was the GAR and retrospective amendments. Recently, the Maruti incident and the failure of the grid has added to that negative perception, and we need to correct that. So I think not only do I think it will help the perception very considerably if these retrospective amendments and the GAR issue are adequately tackled, I do feel that they will do it.
All right, tackling some of those issues is important, but also equally important is perhaps building political consensus. There continue to be political compulsions. That clearly hasn't changed. So are you still hopeful that reforms like GST or FDI and multi-brand retail can go through despite the opposition coming from allies as well as the opposition? They've clearly not been too helpful.
Yes, I feel so, because CII has discussed it with the opposition parties, we have discussed it with the state governments. I think it needs careful analysis by both sides. Give and take is required, and I think it can be done if strong effort is made in that direction.
Mr. Godrej, what according to you can be the best case and the worst case scenario in terms of growth for this year? In the next few months, how quickly do you think can we turn around this is the situation right now, or do you think there are chances that we could even slip further?
Well, I am not overly concerned about this financial year. Of course, I think the worst could be 5.5% growth, and the best for this financial year I see is about a 6.5% growth. But I'm more concerned about the next financial year, because we should concentrate on that so that there is a revival in the next financial year. For the next financial year, if we do nothing, I expect growth will remain at around 6%, but if we act on all fronts, including the goods and services tax and the constitutional amendment relating to the goods and services tax, I think we can grow up to 9% in the next financial year.
Mr. Godrej, before we wrap up, what's your advice for Mr. Chidambaram as the president of CII? What according to you should be the prescription for growth here on?
I think all action should be taken in terms of the reform program. I think the agenda is well known. CII has initiated a 10-point plan. I think Mr. Chidambaram's statement on Monday was excellent, and I think if we move on that path, we can see accelerated growth in India, and that will create a sort of a virtuous cycle which will take other things forward too.
That was Mr. Adi Godrej, President of CII and Chairman of the Godrej Group, who I spoke with earlier. Let me take forward some of the points that he's raised to our panel now. Mr. R.V. Kanoria, President of FICCI, also with us on the panel. Mr. Kanoria, clearly you've heard the views of Mr. Godrej. He seems to be very optimistic that things can turn around. Are you also sharing that similar sentiment? This coming on a day when we've actually seen industrial output contract yet again. We're talking about a negative 1.8% number. Clearly, many signs of worry amid all that optimism.
You know, if you look at the finance minister's statement, I think we can not be anything but extremely encouraged about it. I'll quote two sentences which he said in his press statement. One was that investment is an act of faith, and in order to realize that faith, there is a need for stability in all our laws, in taxation. There's a need to have a certain amount of certainty. And the other point and the other statement which he made was that there is a need to take calibrated risks to get the economy back on the growth path. And I think both these statements, if we look deeply into them, they have tremendous amount of meaning, and you know, the sense of urgency that he has imparted to the office that he has taken up just very recently is in itself, in my opinion, a confidence booster. So I would like to share the optimism that Mr. Godrej has expressed, that you know, if we can change the sentiment and convert some of these statements into real action, I think that we can get back, you know, the Indian economy can certainly come back on the growth path. I mean, there are ground issues which need to be tackled, there is no doubt about that. There is a need fundamentally to change the sentiment and the attitude towards business, which is going to contribute to the growth process. Now coming to the point which you mentioned about
go ahead.
You know, the IIP figures. So the IIP figures, you said, I mean, they are not good, no doubt about it. I mean, minus 1.8% is certainly not a good figure. But what is really disquieting is if you look at the capital goods figure, which is minus 28%. And that clearly shows up that investment is not happening, because capital goods are directly affected by investments. And then we come back to the same story about you know, how to manage interest rates on the one hand and the fiscal deficit on the other hand. And I think that's where the sentence of calibrated risk and also the need to dovetail the monetary policy together with the fiscal policy to ensure that, you know, the hardening of monetary policy is actually, there is a counter to it by an easing of fiscal policy through maybe giving investment allowances, higher depreciation, lowering the MAT rate, and you know, these kinds of agendas have already been presented by FICCI and by industry in general. So I don't think there's any difference in the approach which is being followed. I think it's more the action which is required, and
All right.
And the utterances of the finance minister certainly have built confidence that action will happen.
All right, well begun is perhaps half done, and he seems to have made a good beginning, but is that good enough? Mr. Mohandas Pai, you've been one of the most vocal critics of what's really gone on in the Indian economy. Whenever we spoke in the past, you've spoken about the kind of damage that has been done. Is making right noises good enough, or do you think it's too little, too late? The damage will take a long, long time to be undone.
Well, Shweta, I think the damage will take a long time to get undone, and I don't think good words alone will remedy the damage. Let me explain 2 or 3 things which are required to be done. First, of course, is about GAR and retrospective amendment, and people want to see action. They're not bringing in the money that we expect. Second, the fiscal situation is very, very bad. There is a hole of 1 lakh crores in the budget, and that has to be fixed. The government had budgeted 36,000 crores for oil subsidies, and I'm told they use the money to pay subsidies for the previous year. Is a carry forward. This year, the total subsidy may be about 150,000 crores, or maybe 50,000 crores may be paid by ONGC and Oil India. The government may have to shell down about 1 lakh crores if they don't do anything right now. Indian Oil just now announced a loss of 22,000 crores, HPCL 9,000 crores. The situation is pretty bad, and they have to take action right now. And the third thing is, inflation is high for the last 2.5 years, and inflation has not come down. It's high inflation which is hurting sentiments for consumption, bringing down consumption. The middle class is very squeezed. The lower middle class is deeply hurt. So about 800 million people are suffering because of high inflation, and the government doesn't have anything apart from making some very pious statements about the need to reduce inflation. And on top of that, there's a bad monsoon. And we have finished 4.5 months of this year, which is already gone. And any decision taken now will need another 3 months for an impact. So we need decisions in the next 15 days. And these have to be very hard decisions to fix the fiscal gap by raising diesel prices, and that may help the rupee appreciate and reduce the fiscal deficit even more, and to make sure the steps are taken to bring down expenditure and to raise revenues. For example, the public sector companies have got 2 lakh crores sitting on the balance sheet. Why can't they pay 60-70,000 crores as dividend to the government? It is a non-tax revenue, non-inflationary. Let the money come to the government. And 2, Suti, the erstwhile UTI, has got assets worth 40,000 crores. Axis Bank, L&T, and ITC. Why can't they sell it in the open market immediately? There's a liquid stocks. Together they can get 1 lakh crores. And if they do that, confidence will definitely come back. But I'm sitting on the fence right now because we want action in the next 15 days.
All right, very tough words from Mr. Mohandas Pai. He's saying, well, the window of opportunity is as narrow as 15 days. He's saying quick decisiveness is what is needed. We need those decisions coming almost immediately. But Mr. Nalin Kohli, my question to you is that there's a very important point that was raised by Mr. Mohandas Pai, the ballooning fiscal deficit that obviously needs the government to act and perhaps take some tough decisions like raising diesel prices. Would the opposition allow the government to do so?
Shweta, there are 2 parts here. I think the government needs to move out of its mode of alibi hunting, always finding someone to blame, whether it's the opposition, whether it's international, whether it's anything else, and get down to doing business. That's what they are here for. And I think it's amazing that, all these comments on Mr. Chidambaram are taking place almost as if with the Prime Minister who's an economist, that means your government was not running and what was happening during this time. Why are we in this mess? That's the question to start with. Let's now get back specific to what you're saying about this. And I'd like to point out, when you have issues of subsidies, which may be fertilizers, which may be diesel, and diesel is linked to agricultural output, please bear in mind, we are having a distressed monsoon. We are going to definitely have pressure on farmers, and the pressure will come also in repayment of loans. So it's a cycle.
Right.
The maneuverability of a government suffers dramatically when the resource mobilization takes a hit and your other side is ballooning, and I think that's where this government has landed itself at.
But my pointed question is on diesel prices.
Yes,
on cutting subsidies of petroleum products.
It's a very difficult question, because at the end of the day, already with high inflation and particularly food prices, which are over 10% for the last 38 months. You have to talk of relief to the common man. So
Right,
you just
so
can't keep raising this. So we are stuck in this loop. And I think it's going to take a lot of creative maneuvering from the government.
And that perhaps explains why Mr. Chidambaram's task is so tough. Creative maneuvering, but is it all that easy? Sajid Chinoy, this is clearly a situation where we've got the finance minister who says he wants to cut down the fiscal deficit, but the opposition will not allow it to raise diesel prices. You've got inflation that continues to be sticky and a big worry, given that now we're looking at a drought year. And also you've got interest rates that are high and the industry is crying for interest rates to be brought down. Are high interest rates really hurting growth, and do you see interest rates easing in the next few months? Sajid.
Yeah. Thanks, Shweta. I think it's undeniable that interest rates will have some impact at the margin on investment. But I think to say is that interest rates are the primary determinant of why investment has slowed over the last 2 years, I think is not the correct statement of fact. If you look at real interest rates in India today and you compare them to the mid-2000s, when investment was booming in double digits every year, when industry was booming in double digits every year, these rates are almost identical. Today's real interest rates are very similar to those in the mid-2000s. So really interest rates are not at the heart of the problem. And to cut rates dramatically at a time when you expect large fiscal slippage, when inflation, consumer CPI inflation is running at 10%, when inflation expectations will rise after a bad monsoon, I think would be irresponsible. In fact, I go back to what we've been discussing previously, which is if you look at what the heart of the investment slowdown is, it's a series of implementation issues on the ground. If you look at the number of projects on the ground today that have either been stalled or abandoned as a percent of total projects under implementation, these ratios are 4 and 5 times as high as they were 2 years ago. And cutting interest rates by 50 basis points or 100 basis points will not reverse that trend. I think the issues are well known. These come back to land acquisition, environmental clearances, coal availability, regulatory and policy uncertainty in the power sector or the mining sector. So I come back to the point that if there's finite political capital to be spent in the next 6 months, it really should not be spent on big bang reforms like FDI and multi-brand retail, whose impact will be felt years later. It really should be felt on de-bottlenecking these implementation issues on the ground, one. And the second is to consolidate India's public finances. I think the concern there is if there is no correction in the fiscal deficit over the next 3 or 4 months, we stand the very real risk of being downgraded by S&P and Fitch later this year. That would be catastrophic for India's corporate sector because borrowing costs offshore would jump anywhere between 100 to 200 basis points. So I think the focus really needs to be on containing the fiscal deficit, on debottlenecking issues on the ground, and the central bank really should focus on containing inflation. I'll make one last point. If you look at the details of today's IP print, one of the most sobering statistics is that consumer non-durables have fallen spectacularly over the last 6 months. This consumption has got nothing to do with interest rates. In fact, they've fallen because inflation has been stubbornly high and eaten into real wages and real income. So I think focusing on inflation has to be the job of the RBI. Focusing on growth has to be the job of the government.
All right, that's very well put by Sajid, but I'm going to get the industry reaction from Mr. Kanoria. But before that, a quick word from Mr. Mukesh Agarwal on a point that Sajid has raised there. Are we staring at the possibility of a downgrade if we do not act quickly? As Mr. Mohandas Pai was saying, that we are now talking about a very, very serious situation here and we could be downgraded if we do not act quickly.
Shweta, I will not comment on whether there is a possibility of a downgrade or not because that is being looked after by our parent S&P. But I will add on to what Sajid had said and slow down in investments. I totally agree with him. In fact, I would like to share some facts over here. We had done a poll around 3 weeks back and we had polled NSE 500 companies, and out of those 500, 200 had responded to our poll. And we got some very good findings, and one of the key findings was these 200 companies account for around 70% market cap of the NSE 500 companies excluding BFSI sector, and the poll clearly showed that the investments in the current year at the aggregate level are expected to decline by around 14% this year as compared to last year, and this is on top of around 2% decline in the investments last year. And the poll also showed that we asked them we asked them what are the reasons, why is the investment mood negative in the Indian markets, and we had given them 5 reasons. One of the reasons was policy logjam or delay in project clearances. Second was high interest rate. Third was global uncertainty. Fourth was demand slowdown, and fifth was unavailability of funds. And the topmost reason which came out was policy logjam or delay in clearances of project. That was the most important factor, which 70% of the respondents said that this is the factor, this was the top 2 factors amongst impacting the investments. The number 2 was global uncertainty, third was high interest rates, and fourth was demand slowdown, and fifth was unavailability of funds. So clearly I think today policy logjam or delay in clearances of project is the one which is impacting the slowdown or impacting investments in the country. And another, if you look at interesting finding, was we also asked them, and our surveys showed that not more than 1/4 of the investments will be in the new project this year. 50% of the respondents said that they will not take up any new project this year. And even around 30 companies said that they will defer projects, and deferment amounted to almost 35,000 crores. And deferment was shown in the sectors like metals, infra would be roads, ports, etc. So clearly policy issues are more impacting the growth than the interest rates. And as Sajid had clearly said that pre-crisis, global crisis, if you compare the real interest rates, and if you look at the real interest rates today, they are the same or slightly lower today as compared to the pre-crisis period, but we still managed growth of 9% pre-crisis, global crisis, that is up to 2007 and 8. That was mainly because the global environment was good, investment environment was good, even the fiscal situation was very good. I think so. Other than interest rates, there are a lot of other factors which have impact on the investments.
All right, and very, very shocking data that Mr. Mukesh Agarwal is talking about. They're clearly not a pretty picture at all. But Mr. Kanoria, let me get back to the entire debate that's taking place right now on whether or not an interest rate cut is much needed at this time for revival of the economy. You've heard what Sajid had to say. You heard what Mr. Mukesh Agarwal had to say. At the same time, the industry has been particularly pressing that yes, there is a need to bring down those high interest rates. If going by what Sajid is saying, that will not really help. Why are we pushing for it?
No, I think interest rates are an important component of investment, and if we really study the economic situation today, we cannot de-link inflation from interest rates, in the sense that the fiscal deficit which we are talking about, it continues to be high, and unless it gets controlled, inflation is also going to get compounded, because a lot of the fiscal deficit is caused as a result of subsidies which are actually fueling demand with no corresponding increase in supply. So controlling fiscal deficits is the priority, there is no doubt about it. Fiscal deficit will result in lower inflation. Cutting fiscal deficit will lead to less borrowings by the government, and therefore the private sector will have a better opportunity to participate in the debt markets, and it will result in lowering of interest rates if the fiscal deficit were to be controlled. I think the problems are complex today and they require to be tackled in a holistic manner, and that is why I quoted from the finance minister when he said that we have to take calibrated risks. Those calibrated risks will require corrections at the economic level, which means fiscal deficit and interest rates, and they will require corrections at the ground level, which means acquisition of land, clearances for environment, availability of coal for power, building of infrastructure. So it is not that our problems can be solved by interest rates alone, but interest rates is an important part of the total strategy or the total holistic strategy that has to be adopted to bring the economy back on the growth path. I mean, if we correct interest rates and don't take care of the ground realities and don't make land available and don't make environment clearances available, then there is no way that we can stimulate the economy. So it is not that interest rates and the other issues are mutually exclusive of each other. They need to be tackled simultaneously and holistically.
Mr. Mohandas Pai, your views on this, because you've also got a number of industry leaders, including Mr. KV Kamath, who I spoke with earlier, actually saying that, you know what, perhaps RBI's cautious approach isn't really working. So you've got the RBI trying to say that we're not going to cut interest rates simply because inflation continues to be a big worry. But if that is not helping in bringing down inflation, why not take that bit of a risk and why not actually cut interest rates? Because if we are not being able to attack the policy logjam, at least attack the high interest rates.
Well, Shweta, let's understand the macroeconomic situation. If there is high inflation, what do? You don't stimulate more demand by reducing interest rates. You make sure that you increase interest rates to bring down the demand so that inflation comes down. Now, why is inflation so high? Inflation is so high because the fiscal situation is out of control. Spending is out of control. Revenues are not coming in. Too much government is borrowing too much of money, pumping the economy and stimulating demand, and that is leading to high inflation. So what should be the solution? The solution should be cut down the fiscal deficit, maybe reduce the subsidies, and that will automatically mean that the RBI will have some flexibility to bring down maybe the bank rate or whatever it is, send a signal to the marketplace. Now the fiscal situation is coming down, government borrowal may come down, so the interest may come down. If interest is coming down, is it going to stimulate investment? It's not going to stimulate investment for the next 1 year. Like you said, there's so many logjams. Is it going to stimulate consumption? It's not going to happen because people want to see the result of inflation coming down, and inflation will take 6 to 7 months to come down. So please understand the complex situation. Interest rates, bringing down interest rate is not the solution. Is not going to increase investment right now. Is not going to increase consumption. There's a whole lot of things that have to be done. But the root of the problem is excessive government spending, the policy logjam, and if these two things are not done, optimism will not come in. There is pessimism all around. There is no optimism. And this has to happen immediately because we're going to kiss goodbye to this year if we don't do it before August 10th, before Parliament ends its session.
Sajid, a quick word from you, because there are many who actually disagree with that view. I know Mr. Mohandas Pai and you clearly believe that cutting interest rates will not help, but how would you respond to those who are saying it's time to look at a new way of a new economic model really? Because while it makes economic sense to keep interest rates high if inflation is a worry, but it is time to perhaps experiment and take those risks. And it was none other than the finance minister also talking about perhaps those calibrated risks, and what we understand is that he clearly means that it's time to take that risk by cutting interest rates to see how inflation really reacts. And it's the finance minister himself also saying, you know what, interest rates are very high. And we do get a sense that he's going to work with the RBI and perhaps put that pressure on the central bank to bring down rates. Do you think that's going to be a mistake?
Well, let's be clear. This experimental kind of medicine has been tried before, Shweta. Turkey tried this a couple of years ago, where they slashed interest rates. The outcomes were very undesirable. The central bank had to raise rates 400 basis points, and they have a far more stable macroeconomic situation now. So I think flirting with experimental economics is very dangerous. Undoubtedly, interest rate cuts will stimulate demand and investment at the margin. But cutting interest rates before you take care of some of these supply side bottlenecks and the fiscal deficit, in my view, is tantamount to putting the cart before the horse. If there is credible measures to reduce the fiscal deficit in the medium term, if there is a determination to reduce subsidies, and we have a sense that the deficit comes down, if there are measures taken to increase supply side then by all means I think the RBI will be quite prepared to reduce rates in a calibrated manner over the next year or so. But for the RBI to be cutting rates now when there has been no development on the fiscal deficit at all, I think is very dangerous. So why not do the things that are riskless? Working on some of these implementation issues will not stoke more inflation and will certainly cause a pickup in investment momentum. So why doesn't industry clamor more for some of those bottlenecks to be cleared rather than rates being cut? I'll make one final point. If you speak to any entrepreneur and say, would you rather have a 50 or 100 basis point rate cut, or would you rather have a faster clearance by 3 or 6 months? he'll pick the latter, because if you've borrowed at 12%, a project delay of 6 months is tantamount to a 600 basis point impact on your bottom line, which is far more than cutting rates by 50 or 75 basis points.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there. Why are you talking of an either-or situation there? Why not both? Why are you saying either-or? Either address the policy logjam or cut interest rates. We're saying attack it from all fronts. That's exactly what Mr. Kanodia was also saying, that there's a need for a multi-pronged approach right now. Just one policy prescription will not help.
Because sequencing matters. Yeah, sequencing matters. If you cut interest rates right now and you do not stimulate investment because there are real issues on the ground that are blocking capital investment, what you will do is stoke more consumption and stoke more consumer demand without creating the supply that needs to service that demand. I'll give you one statistic. If you look at credit growth over the last 6 months or so, you've seen lending for personal loans and for consumption has gone up very sharply, whereas lending to industry has stayed flat because interest rates are not at the moment what's blocking investment. So there is a danger here that if you cut rates prematurely, you will stoke more consumption and more inflation without creating the necessary investment and supply to service that demand.
But clearly interest rates may be suppressing the consumer demand, which overall plays a role in that growth slowdown. Sajid, I'll come back to you, but a quick word from Nalin Kohli here. Would you agree with the view right now that inflation continues to be a bigger worry and has perhaps become an even bigger worry with the bad monsoon than the slowdown in growth? Because it is really a trade-off that we're talking about here perhaps.
I don't think it's a trade-off, and I think that message is coming out clearly from different panelists, and I think I agree with the approach that the question here is the interest rate reduction is not a silver bullet that everything will get solved. It certainly is easy in terms of giving a direction, and there are certainly fundamental issues with the economy which are far more difficult.
It could be a sentiment changer.
Well, I just want to talk about it because I do believe that it is one of the important things to consider. I do not think that I would say that keep them high. I'm talking in a holistic picture.
Right.
Certainly interest rates need to be considered, because if I look at it, but at the same time supply side is equally important. You just can't boost demand and therefore push the inflationary trend any further. So I think it's one of the things to consider, but just not the only thing. I think that's the first point. Second is, I think the important thing in front of the government at the moment is that they need to start taking policy decisions. And the word policy paralysis, decision deficit, these are not coined by any political party. They are coming from industry.
Right.
And industry is crying, I think, because you have a situation, this is going to lead to further unemployment issues if industry is not robust, and you have a ballooning fiscal deficit problem. So if you're going to cut on revenue, which comes directly from economic practices and industry, and you have a ballooning fiscal deficit problem, I think we are heading for further disaster, and I think the government needs to start taking decisions.
A disaster indeed. Mr. Mukesh Agarwal, you've actually cut the growth forecast to 5.5% for this fiscal. Is that the number that you're now working at? We're clearly not going to grow at the 6% levels that we were talking about earlier.
See, if you look at the reduction in the GDP forecast for the current year is mainly on account of two factors. One is the monsoon deficiency, which is expected to be around 15% this year, and second is expected recession in the Eurozone. We are looking at minus 0.6% growth in Eurozone. So, but this does not factor in any swift action by the government. So what we are saying that if the government doesn't take any swift action in resolving policy related issues, then we expect the GDP growth to be around 5.5%. But if government does take some action on resolving this policy related issues related to mining, land acquisition, fuel pricing, fuel linkages for the power plants, etc., if those actions are taken, definitely there could be an upside to the GDP growth. Now, I'll come back to the points which Sajid and others have said. We also believe that even if RBI cuts the repo rate by 50-75 basis points, it might not transmit into the system, might not bring down the interest rates in the market, because given the expected slippages in the government's fiscal situation or fiscal deficit, we at CRISIL, we expect the government's fiscal deficit to be around 6.2% in the current financial year. So yes, interest rates have to be brought down, but again, what sequence and how, it is very important. And we believe that currently we need to make the mood very positive. We need to take care of the policy issues. Those will help, and once that happens, then probably we can look at interest rates. But interest rates, again, inflation is a big issue. If you look at monsoon deficiency, food inflation has been very high over the last few years. So I think government has to take care of this kind of issues, reduce spending on the consumption side, focus on improving productivity, and especially agri productivity. I think, and especially if you look at the current scenario when we expect the monsoons to be bad, the imports of cereals and the pulses etc. will have to be very timely. If we don't do timely imports, probably that could further choke up the inflation.
All right, on that note, we're going to slip into a quick break. But on the other side of the break, we're going to discuss whether or not we can achieve that 6% growth number for this year. And also, what is it that Mr. Chidambaram needs to do almost immediately to revive the economy? That's coming up after a quick break.
High interest rates inhibit the investor and are a burden on every class of borrowers.
We feel rates must come down because they are definitely coming in the way of growth.
I don't believe that it is the interest rates which are preventing investment. There are a lot of supply side factors which are causing inflation.
Welcome back. You're with We Mean Business, and we're discussing the state of the economy and whether or not high interest rates are actually dampening growth. Mr. R.V. Kanoria, we've seen an interesting discussion here, and I know the industry view has always been that yes, there is a need to cut interest rates. Let me actually now get a quick poll from all our panelists as to where they see the growth rate for this year, and also what are the three things that Mr. Chidambaram should act on almost immediately to revive growth.
I think that the growth rate will be in the region of 5.5 to 6%, and the mother of all problems is the fiscal deficit. And in my opinion, it's not a question of biting the bullet so much on interest rates, but biting the bullet on many decisions which will have political implications, and that's really attacking some of the subsidies which are being given. Now I firmly believe that subsidies do play their role in the socio-economic context in India, but at the same time we need to ensure that these subsidies are first of all better targeted. We need to ensure that the delivery systems are better, and that those subsidies which are not meant for sections of society which need them, they should be reduced or done away with. And I think particularly if I look at diesel subsidies, there is a misconception that diesel is used by the farm sector. If you look at the numbers, the maximum consumption of diesel I am told is by telephone towers, and that the farm sector is only using about 17% of the total diesel. So there is a case for realigning the petroleum subsidies. There is also a case for realigning fertilizer subsidies. Even though it's a drought year, I think fertilizers cannot substitute rain, or they cannot substitute water, and in many ways the subsidies which we have on fertilizer are actually jeopardizing the soil, because they are encouraging the use of particular types of fertilizers which may not necessarily be the right nutrients, which need to be rotated, changed. This debate about interest rates, there is no doubt interest rates play a very important role, and industry would very much like to see interest rates come down, not from the point of view of consumption, but more from the point of view of stimulating investment, because what may not appear to be a problem today is bound to become a problem 2 years down the road, because supply will get choked if there is no investment. So we have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of short-term policy versus long-term needs of the country. And that is where interest rates are going to play a very critical role, because they will help in getting the right returns on investment for industry.
All right.
I just want to make a point
Sure.
on the diesel subsidy issue, which Mr. Kanoria was saying about the farm sector. I think we need to understand that diesel essentially is used in three areas. One is transportation, and two areas broadly, and the second is power generation. Now, basically in the farm sector or even industrial, where factories are forced to run on gensets, the core problem is there's no power. So I mean, essentially, if there is power generation, you don't need a diesel genset to give backup power. And if you study state by state, barring a few states, and I'm happy to point out, Chhattisgarh, one of our BJP ruled states, provides 100% power to farmers, but there are multiple states across the country where there is no power and the farmer loses out on pumping water, because essentially land is irrigated by pulling up water. So I mean, that's where when I talk about it in a focused manner, when you have basically farm sector under pressure, if you are raising the input prices, and already there are numerous reports by the Swaminathan Commission, others about rising input prices, it's becoming economically unviable with a burgeoning population. You just can't add to that plate any more expenses that drives the farmer absolutely towards suicide, which also is a reality, unfortunately, in our country. So I want to make it in that context. We cannot be insensitive to that. It's of course makes fiscal prudence to talk about removal of subsidies, but you have to also see it in the larger context of social equity, and we can't be insensitive to that.
Mr. Mohandas Pai, let me put it simply. It's good economics.
May I come in there?
Terrible politics.
I don't want to be misunderstood.
Mr. Kanoria, okay, respond to that. Respond to that before I go to Mr. Pai. Quickly, sir.
Yeah, the first thing I said was that subsidies should be targeted, and that in the socio-economic context they are needed for this country. So it is, if the farm sector needs diesel at a subsidized rate, the farm sector should get it. But why should others which don't need diesel at subsidized rates get it? That's my point which I am trying to make. So we need to be very focused in our approach on how we distribute those subsidies.
I was adding to it.
And what sections of society receive those subsidies needs to be understood.
Okay, we've heard both sides, but Mr. Mohandas Pai, is it wishful thinking to expect that Mr. Chidambaram will get a sympathetic year in a drought year, when we're looking at a bad monsoon, when inflation is continuing to be very sticky, and you've seen the reaction of the opposition clearly, to really expect that we're going to see diesel prices being raised at a point like this? Isn't it mere wishful thinking? Will it not be political harakiri?
Shweta, not raising diesel prices is a much more terrible consequence for the people of this country than raising diesel prices. Sitting quiet and not doing anything has brought India to this morass where we are sinking as a country and everything is going down and unemployment will go up. Yes, drought is coming in, that's a real problem, and that problem can be tackled in a very different manner. Now we have to raise diesel prices by say 3 rupees, and if you raise diesel prices, the rupee may well appreciate, because confidence in the rupee may come back that the government is doing something. Let's say we restrict the use of LPG cylinders to 4 per year per family. That will bring down subsidy by, let's say, 10,000 crores. Let's say we restrict the use of diesel to fewer liters per person because they're all being sold in the black market. That will reduce subsidy by 10,000 crores. These will reduce subsidy by 60,000 crores. And then if you take other measures, like I said, selling off ITC and other shares, which will give you some 30-40,000 crores, asking the public sector to pay out some cash dividend and getting 1 lakh crores. Between the three policies, you will get something like 1,50,000-1,60,000 crores, and that will set the fiscal fisc in a proper manner, and that will restore confidence. And then policy decision. Let me give one small example. Now up to 20,000 meters of building construction, all of the country need environment clearance. Why 20,000 meters? Make it 200,000 meters, because all the buildings are building cities. That will reduce 80% of the approvals that are going to the government, and that will improve sentiments. So take some small policy decisions, raise these prices, restore confidence in the rupee so that imports can become cheaper to increase supplies, and within some short period of time we will have a better thing. Can you do it politically? It's going to be difficult, but I don't think the government has any choice. If the government does not do anything else, the situation will become even worse for the people of this country.
Politically difficult or politically impossible?
Very quickly.
Quick response.
I want to give a very quick response to it from a political perspective. I think the government has lost the maneuverability space. For example, another way of handling, the subsidy issue is to reduce the taxes that the government is collecting on fuel, and ultimately it all comes back to the government pool. So what we are talking about all the time is better economic management, because that essentially is the core of the problem. I mean, otherwise we are looking at it from sector
Nalin,
to sector.
asking the government to give up its revenues coming from petroleum products in a year when we are already seeing such pressure on revenues, the growth slowing down, when expenditures are raising. It's all about economic management, and the government clearly does find itself in a clear bind. Sajid, are there any easy answers out of this mess, especially on the issue of tackling fiscal deficit? Because you know that this is not going to be easy, and we've particularly always spoken about a milestone, a game changer coming, especially from New Delhi. Do you see the change of guard in terms of a new finance minister as that big game changer?
Well, let's hope so. I think the government needs to be given credit to the extent that at least the GAR issue and the Vodafone taxation issue, they have set up for review, and there's a good chance that those may eventually be watered down, which would be good for investor sentiment and capital inflows. But the heart of the issue really is the fiscal deficit, and let's understand what the scope of the challenge is this particular year. The deficit was predicated on GDP growth of 7.6%. I think there's now widespread belief that growth will be perhaps even lower than 6%, which means your tax collections this year will be under significant pressure. There was estimates of 0.8% of GDP being collected through non-tax forms. This is the disinvestment and the telecom auctions, and we haven't seen much traction on the disinvestment front at all. If you have a drought-like situation, you will have your automatic stabilizers kick in, and so there is a very good chance that NREGA payouts this year might be higher than budgeted, because in a drought year the demand for NREGA would go up. So even without tackling subsidies, the scope for fiscal slippage being sort of 1% or so is very real. And on the other hand, if crude prices remain at $100 per barrel, and the rupee is at 55 to the dollar, and there is no change in diesel prices, just the oil subsidy will slip compared to budget targets by about 0.5% of GDP. So the challenge is enormous, and my worry is that, as you said, a drought is going to constrain the hands of policymakers. But if decisive action is not taken, Shweta, I think several things happen. Inflation stays elevated. It becomes harder for the RBI to cut rates. Government borrowing will be very high, and that will crowd out investment later in the year. But most of all, I think we risk then a ratings downgrade from S&P and Fitch. And what that will do is, for all the corporates who borrow offshore, that pushes up your borrowing cost anywhere between 100 to 200 basis points, and that's then another drag on investment growth. So I think we will eventually have to bite the fiscal bullet. So this year clearly is a very tricky one given what's happening with the monsoon.
Will they bite the bullet or not remains the big question. The last word coming clearly from Mr. Mukesh Agarwal. We're unfortunately talking about more drags and downsides to the economy than any upsides. So perhaps your downgraded growth forecast is of 5.5% is what's looking more likely. But Mr. Mukesh Agarwal, what according to you constitutes the biggest threat to recovery right now?
I think the biggest threat to the economy is inflation and the fiscal situation. If the government is not able to contain the fiscal deficit, which we are expecting to be around 6.2%, and the fiscal, if you look at the inflation has continues, especially the retail inflation continues to be more than 10%, and given the drought situation, that is already putting pressure on the inflation. So if we are not able to control the inflation and the fiscal deficit, that will make the things difficult for us. So government really needs to tackle these two issues along with the policy related issues.
Clearly decisive action is needed to tackle inflation, because that remains the heart of the problem. The government has to move forward, bite the bullet in terms of tackling the ballooning fiscal deficit, because clearly a downgrade coming from the credit rating agencies, as Sajid was saying, is something that we clearly cannot afford. At the same time, we'll have to wait and see if we're going to see the RBI and the Finance Ministry working in tandem to deal with the twin objectives of ensuring that the recovery in growth takes place. At the same time, we're able to tame inflation. With that, it's a wrap here on We Mean Business. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your views, and we'll have to wait and see how the government really reacts to those very, very difficult challenges that lie ahead of it. Remember, you can also send us your feedback on the show. The details, they're coming up on your screen. You can send in an email to wmb@ndtv.com. You can SMS us at WMB space your comments at 56388, or you can send me a message on my Twitter handle at ShwetaRK. NDTV. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.